24 hours before my wedding. I was standing inside a brick warehouse on the Cape Fear River, the one I had spent 2 years reinforcing beam by beam, when my mother told 80 guests that my ceremony could wait. My name is Nora Ashford. I'm 33 years old, and I repair the bones of old buildings for a living, the parts nobody sees until they fail. That night, I learned my own family had a structural problem I'd been patching in the dark for years. The rehearsal dinner was supposed to be simple. Toasts, a few photographs, the kind of evening you forget by the time the real wedding starts. My mother, Renata, had other plans. She waited until the room had gone quiet, until every fork had stopped moving. And then she stood up. "Nora is postponing the wedding," she announced, like she was reading a headline someone else had already approved. "She's giving Paige the $85,000 for her venue deposit." A few guests actually clapped. My future husband's aunt clapped. Before I could open my mouth, my mother slid a transfer form across the table and tapped the signature line with one manicured finger. I looked at my sister. Paige wouldn't meet my eyes. She was wearing silver, not white, but close enough that 3 people at the next table had already asked her if she was the bride. "No," I said. That single word did something to my mother's face I'd never seen before. Not hurt. Insulted. "You still get to marry Julian," Paige said suddenly, like the words had been sitting behind her teeth all night. "I lost everything. You could have another wedding someday. I might not get another chance." "You don't have a groom?" I said. Her jaw tightened. "That's temporary." And there it was. Not desperation, not heartbreak. A campaign? My sister didn't want a wedding. She wanted an audience. My mother's hand moved before I understood what was happening. The slap landed hard enough that my ears rang, hard enough that I felt it in my teeth. Somewhere behind me, a chair scraped back. "Look what you made me do," my mother said, already stepping away from her own hand, like it belonged to someone else. 6 words. I'd heard some version of them my whole life. Look what you made me hide. Look what you made me borrow. Look what you made me tell your sister. This was just the first time it came with an open palm attached. My face was burning, but I didn't reach for it. I straightened instead, and I looked at every table in that warehouse, one after another, slow enough that people had to look back. "You picked this audience," I said, "so we'll keep it." Nobody clapped this time. My best friend, Dana, was 3 feet away, and I saw her, out of the corner of my eye, lift her phone and quietly start recording, not asking permission, not making a scene of her own, just documenting one. That's when the doors at the back of the warehouse opened, and Julian walked in carrying a black case with a lock on it. He'd spent the evening across town with an attorney, not because he suspected this exact moment was coming, but because 3 weeks earlier, he'd started asking questions nobody in my family wanted answered. He looked at my face, at the mark already rising on my cheek, and something in his expression went very still. "What happened?" he asked. My mother answered first. "Nora made a scene because I asked her to help her sister." Julian didn't look at her. He looked at me. "Did she hit you?" "Yes," I said. "Before I tell you what was inside that case, because it wasn't just paperwork, and it wasn't just about the $85,000. I want to ask you something. Where are you watching this from tonight? And what time is it where you are? I've always wondered how far a night like this one actually travels. To understand why my mother believed she could stand in a room full of witnesses and hand my future to my sister. You have to go back 10 years. To the spring my father died. His name was Walter Ashford, and he spent 30 years teaching contractors across the Carolinas how to tell the difference between a wall that would hold and a wall that was lying to them. He ran a small structural firm out of a converted garage, the kind of business that survives on reputation and nearly nothing else. When his heart gave out on a Tuesday morning, he left behind 11 employees, a half-finished inspection report, and debts nobody in my family had known existed. I was 23. I had just started my first real job, and instead of grieving the way I wanted to, I spent my nights redrawing load calculations at my father's kitchen table so his crew could keep working. I called every creditor myself. I paid 2 suppliers out of my own checking account so they wouldn't walk. Within a year, the company wasn't just surviving, it was solvent again. My mother told a different story. At every dinner, every church function, every anniversary of his death, she described how she had kept the company standing. When relatives praised me for the hours I put in, she'd correct them gently, like she was being modest. "Nora helped with some of the paperwork," she'd say. "I'm the one who held this family together. I let her have it." Not because I didn't notice, but because of something my father used to say when I was small. Standing next to him while he checked a beam with a flashlight. Never let the lights go dark on people who are still inside the building. I told myself that keeping my mother's version of events intact was part of keeping the lights on. I had promised him, in the vaguest, most unspoken way a 23-year-old promises anything, that nobody would lose their job because our family fell apart. My sister, Paige, was 17 when our father died, and everyone agreed she should be protected from the worst of it. She was grieving. She was sensitive. She wasn't built for pressure the way I apparently was. While I was learning how to read a balance sheet at midnight, Paige was encouraged to find herself. She tried modeling. She tried event planning. When those didn't work out, my mother called them experiments. When I kept the lights on for 11 families, she called it my duty. There's a specific afternoon I still think about, the year I turned 24. An invoice for structural steel had gone unpaid for 6 weeks, and I was on the phone with the supplier, negotiating a payment plan, when Paige wandered into the kitchen, looked at the paper in my hand, and shrugged. "You'll figure it out," she said. "You always do." She wasn't being cruel. That was the problem. She said it the way you'd say the sun would come up tomorrow. It didn't occur to either of us that certainty like that could calcify into something else over the following decade, something closer to a plan than a compliment. By the time I was 30, the company had a name people trusted again. My mother had a story she told at parties, and my sister had learned that consequences, in our house, were something that happened to other families. None of us called it a debt. We called it love. 2 years after I stabilized the company, my mother called me crying about the house. She said the bank had sent a notice that foreclosure proceedings could start within 90 days. That losing the house where my father used to check every beam himself before letting the family upstairs would be like losing him twice. I remember sitting in my car outside her office, engine still running, listening to her voice shake in a way I had never heard before. I set up an automatic transfer that week, $2,850 a month, routed through a small holding company I registered under a name that meant nothing to anyone but me, Cape Fern Holdings. My mother believed the payments came from a refinancing arrangement her bank had approved out of goodwill. I let her believe it, because she told me, more than once, that accepting money directly from her own daughter would humiliate her in front of people who still thought of her as the woman who saved the family business alone. That was my first real mistake, though I wouldn't understand it as a mistake for years. When you hide the size of your own sacrifice to protect someone else's pride, you give them room to convince themselves it never happened at all. The second warning came 18 months later, when Paige launched a company she called Bloomfield Staging Co., promising clients a full home transformation in 72 hours, photographed for social media before the paint had even finished drying. She told me an investor had backed out 3 weeks before her first big showcase, and she needed $24,500 to avoid public embarrassment. I transferred it as a loan, in writing, and asked for receipts. She never sent a single one. Months later, digging through an old email thread looking for something else entirely, I found a pattern of charges that had nothing to do with staging furniture. A resort outside Asheville, A boutique that sold nothing under $400 a dress. A freelance photographer whose entire portfolio was styled aspirational, empty rooms with captions about building something real. When I asked Paige about it directly, she didn't flinch. "Image is part of the business," she said, like I was the one being unreasonable. My mother, when I mentioned it, defended her without hesitation. "At least Paige is brave enough to put herself out there," she said. I had just finished stabilizing the load-bearing trusses on a 19th century warehouse the city had nearly condemned. In my mother's eyes, none of that counted as visible, because nobody had photographed it. Julian was the first person outside my own head who noticed the shape of what was happening. He worked in bank fraud investigation, which meant he had spent years learning to read the small inconsistencies people leave behind when a story doesn't match the paperwork. He didn't accuse anyone. He just asked questions, quietly, the way he asked questions about everything. "If you're covering the mortgage every month," he said one night, laying 2 bank statements side by side on our kitchen table, "why does your mother's account still show late fees?" I didn't have an answer. I told him I'd look into it. Not really, not for another 4 months, because looking into it meant admitting that the story I'd built my whole adult life around might not hold the weight I needed it to. At first, I defended all of them, out loud and in my own head. Wasn't my mother a widow? Wasn't Paige still finding her footing? Wasn't I lucky enough to be the one with something to give? But somewhere in that same season, a different question started showing up uninvited. Usually late at night, usually when the house was quiet enough that I couldn't out-argue it. At what point does helping someone stop being generosity and start being permission? 6 weeks before the wedding, my mother asked to see our full wedding budget. I told her no. Somehow, within days. She knew the exact number sitting in our vendor account, $85,000. I never told her that figure. Paige had been in the room during a dress fitting 3 weeks earlier, alone with my laptop for less than 10 minutes while I was down the hall in the fitting room. I didn't confront her about it. I changed the account permissions that same night, and I told no one why. 4 days before the rehearsal dinner, Paige's second engagement ended in a parking lot outside a furniture showroom. I only got the full version from a cousin who'd been there. Paige's fiance had opened his business credit card statement and found nearly $6,000 in charges he'd never approved. All of it routed through Bloomfield Staging Co. for a showcase Paige had promised would finally put her brand on the map. When he confronted her, she didn't apologize. She told him he was being petty about money at the worst possible time. By that evening, the story circulating through my family was different. According to Paige, he had walked away from her because she wasn't wealthy enough to keep up with his lifestyle. My mother repeated this version at least 3 times before dinner the next night, each time with a little more outrage attached to it, as though the injustice compounded with every retelling. The next morning, my mother called my florist. I found out because the florist called me back within the hour, apologetic and confused, asking whether my deposit was refundable and whether the order should be moved under a different name. My mother had introduced herself as handling arrangements on my behalf and asked, almost as an afterthought, if the contract could simply be reissued to Paige instead. I called the venue coordinator at Ironbridge Warehouse next, mostly to make sure nothing had already been changed. She confirmed it hadn't, but she sounded careful in a way she hadn't sounded in 6 months of planning calls. "Your mother's called here twice," she said. "I wanted you to hear that from me before Saturday." I sat with that for a long moment after we hung up. Some part of me had been building a case against my own family for months, quietly, the way you'd document a crack in a foundation before deciding whether the building was actually in danger. This was the first time the crack had shown up somewhere I couldn't pretend not to notice. That night, I locked every vendor account under my name alone. New passwords, new verification questions, nothing anyone else could access without going through me directly. Julian asked if I wanted to talk to my mother before the rehearsal dinner, get ahead of whatever she was planning. I told him no. I told him I thought I already knew, and that I'd rather see exactly how far she intended to take it than corner her into backing down early and doing it again some other way. At some other event, when I wasn't paying as much attention, I didn't know yet how wrong I was about the size of it. By the time I understood how far my mother meant to take it, I was already standing in the middle of it, and there was no version of that evening where I got to see it coming in time. The rehearsal dinner started the way these things usually do. String lights strung between the warehouse's original iron trusses, the ones I had personally reinforced 18 months earlier. 80 guests found their seats. Julian's aunt cried a little during the first toast, the way aunts do. I remember thinking, for maybe the last uncomplicated hour of the night, that the building looked exactly the way I'd hoped it would when I first pitched the restoration to the city. My mother arrived in white, not ivory, not champagne, white, the kind that catches a room's attention before a single word gets said. Paige came in behind her in a floor-length silver dress that 2 separate guests mistook, out loud, for a second bride's gown. I noticed and said nothing, because by then I had learned that noticing out loud only ever cost me something. My mother waited. She always waited for the exact right silence, the one where every fork has stopped moving and every conversation has trailed off on its own, so that whatever she said next would land in a room already listening. "I want to say something before the toasts continue," she said, rising from her chair with a folder in one hand. "Nora and Julian have agreed to postpone the wedding. They're redirecting the $85,000 set aside for the ceremony to help Paige secure her venue." Somebody clapped. Then 2 more people clapped. Uncertain, following the first sound in the room the way people do at events where nobody wants to be the one who reacts wrong. My mother set a transfer form beside my plate before I had said a single word, and tapped the signature line twice with one finger, like she was reminding a child where to write their name. I pushed it back toward her. "Since when," I said, "did we agree to that?" "Since I raised you to take care of this family," she said. "Since your father would have wanted his daughters supporting each other." I looked at Paige. She was looking at the tablecloth. "You still get to marry Julian," she said quietly, not quite meeting my eyes even now. "I lost everything. You could plan another wedding. I might not get another chance at any of this." "You don't have a groom anymore," I said. Her jaw went tight. "That's temporary." That was the moment I understood, fully, that this had never been about a venue deposit. My sister wanted a photographed event with her name on the invitations. Something with enough polish to resurrect a brand that was already dying quietly behind the scenes. The groom, whoever he turned out to be, was a prop she assumed she could source later. My mother's hand moved before I had time to brace for it. The slap landed hard enough that the room actually went silent. Hard enough that for a second I heard nothing at all. Just a ringing that swallowed the string quartet and the 80 conversations, and the soft clink of glassware all at once. "Look what you made me do," my mother said, already backing away from her own hand as though it had acted without her. I didn't cry and I didn't apologize, which I think surprised her more than the slap surprised me. I straightened my spine, wiped my cheek with the back of my wrist, and looked, slowly, at every table in that warehouse, the way my father once taught me to walk a job site before signing off on it, checking each point of the structure before deciding whether it would hold. "You wanted witnesses," I said. "You have them." Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Dana lift her phone, unhurried, and begin quietly recording, her expression giving away nothing at all. That was when the warehouse doors opened at the back of the room, and Julian walked in carrying a black case with a lock on it, and the temperature of the entire evening changed before he'd said a single word. Julian set the case on the nearest table and opened it without hurrying. The way he did everything, like speed, was a thing other people needed and he'd never quite understood why. "They should probably hear where the money's actually been going," he said, not looking at my mother, not looking at Paige, looking at me just once, checking whether I still wanted this to happen in front of 80 people. I gave him the smallest nod I had. He pulled out the first folder. "For the last 3 years, Nora's covered your mortgage," he said, laying a bank statement flat on the table so the numbers faced my mother instead of him. $2,850 a month routed through a company called Cape Fern Holdings. You told people an investor believed in your judgment enough to carry the loan. Every time you said that, you were describing money your daughter sent you and asked you never to mention. Somewhere behind me, a chair legs scraped against the warehouse floor. I didn't turn around right away, but I caught the shape of it from the corner of my eye, a member of the Historic Preservation Board. A woman who had personally approved the grant for this building's restoration, quietly gathering her clutch and stepping back from the table like she needed distance before deciding what she'd just heard. My mother's mouth opened. Nothing came out of it yet. $24,500, Julian continued, setting a second document beside the first. A loan to Bloomfield Staging Co., requested for an investor shortfall that current records suggest never existed. Less than half of it ever touched the business. That sounds dramatic, Paige said, too fast. It's also documented, Julian said, and didn't raise his voice once. A man near the back, someone I recognized as a former client of my father's firm, someone whose porch had nearly caved in the year before we rebuilt it, looked directly at Paige. "Didn't you tell my wife your company had 3 investors lined up?" he asked, not unkindly, more like he genuinely wanted the arithmetic to make sense and it wasn't making sense at all. Paige didn't answer him. She looked at the tablecloth again, the same place she'd been looking since the slap. Julian opened the third folder last. "This is the one that matters most," he said. 3 separate documents using the Ashford family home and Ashford Structural Group as collateral for a private credit line, opened 8 months ago. 2 of the 3 signatures on these forms were generated from a device registered to Paige. The room went the particular kind of quiet that isn't peaceful. My mother reached for the edge of the table like she needed it to stay upright, but she didn't faint, and she didn't look away. She sat there fully conscious while every consequence she'd spent a decade avoiding arrived at once, in front of the exact people whose opinion of her had always mattered more than mine ever had. "You investigated me," Paige said. "You tried to access a wedding account that wasn't yours." I said. "The trail led back to you on its own." My mother found her voice again, thinner now. "Alder Cape Fern," she corrected herself. "Cape Fern Holdings is mine. I don't know what he's talking about." "Every statement for 3 years came from an account with my name on the filing," I said. "Every time you told someone an investor respected your judgment. You were talking about money I sent, so you wouldn't have to say the word daughter out loud." The warehouse's event coordinator, who had spent 6 months on calls with me about lighting rigs and floor plans and exactly none of this, stepped forward from where she'd been standing near the bar. She didn't address my mother directly. She addressed the room. "I want to be clear that this building is under contract to Nora and Julian tonight," she said. "Not to anyone else. I won't be taking further instruction from anyone but them." It was a small correction, procedural, almost bureaucratic, and it did more damage to my mother than the documents had. She had walked into rooms and owned them through sheer force for as long as I'd been alive. Money, reputation, a raised voice at the right moment. All of it had always worked. Watching it simply fail to work, in real time, in front of 80 witnesses, seemed to cost her something the bank statements hadn't touched yet. "This can still be corrected," she said quietly, to no one in particular. "Only with full disclosure," Julian said. "Everything in these folders is a copy. The originals are already with counsel." Paige reached for the papers anyway. He moved them, gently, out of her reach. My mother looked at me the way she used to when I was small and had scraped a knee, an expression built for softening a room. built to make me want to fix whatever was in front of her before morning. Nora, we can handle this as a family. You slapped me in front of 80 people 20 minutes ago, I said. I was upset. You tried to take $85,000 that wasn't yours. I wanted to help your sister. You let her use the house and the company as collateral for a credit line neither of us knew existed. I didn't fully understand the paperwork, she said. And for the first time all night, Paige turned on her instead of me. Don't blame me, Paige snapped. You signed it. They turned on each other so fast it was almost a relief, in a terrible way, to watch the argument finally point somewhere other than at me. My mother accused Paige of lying about the credit line's purpose. Paige accused my mother of needing 2 successful daughters badly enough to overlook exactly how the second one was manufacturing her success. Somewhere in the middle of it, Paige admitted, almost as an aside, that Ironbridge Warehouse had never actually promised her a date. She'd asked them to hold one, without a groom, because she'd been planning to stage an engagement announcement of her own, regardless of what happened to mine. A cousin, 2 tables away, asked, loud enough for half the room to hear, whether she had genuinely tried to take my wedding fund for content. My mother finally turned to the room and told everyone to leave. The coordinator reminded her, evenly, that she didn't have the authority to end an event she wasn't contracted to host. I asked Julian for the last folder. Inside was a letter terminating all further support to my mother and to Cape Fern Holdings, effective immediately, with one final mortgage payment already scheduled to close out the arrangement cleanly. She could sell the house on her own terms, or the Preservation Trust overseeing the property could begin proceedings without her. Ashford Structural Group's legitimate contracts and its 11 employees would transfer into an employee-owned entity, protecting their jobs while removing both my mother and my sister from any financial authority over the company my father built. You'd take his company from me, my mother said. I'm keeping 11 families from going down with it, I said. That's not the same thing. She told me my father would be ashamed of me. I'd heard some version of that sentence for 10 years, always attached to whatever sacrifice she needed next. Save the house for him. Protect Paige for him. Hide the mistakes for him. But the dead don't get a vote in how they're used as leverage, and somewhere between the 3rd folder and the 4th, I'd stopped being willing to let her cast one on his behalf. He taught me to check every beam before I let people underneath it. I said. You hid the damage and expected me to keep holding the roof up anyway. My mother asked for until after the wedding to fix things quietly, before word spread any further. Even then, in the wreckage of her own evening, the audience still mattered more to her than I did. They've been watching all night, I told her. That's the only reason any of this is true to you now. I laid my stained jacket over the transfer form still sitting on the table, and I walked out with Julian. My mother called my name once behind me. I didn't turn around. We drove to the studio apartment above my project office without talking much, and I spent most of the ride watching stained fabric dry stiff against my collarbone instead of looking out the window, inside, while I rinsed the last of the coffee smell out of my hair in a sink too small for the job. Julian sat at the kitchen table and laid out what would likely happen next, calmly, the way he explained everything. Like panic was a variable he refused to let into the equation. An independent audit would determine whether Paige's forged signatures rose to the level of fraud. My mother could reduce her own liability significantly if she cooperated honestly with investigators. If she chose to protect Paige instead, both of them could end up equally responsible for the debt. The house would likely be sold, regardless of how any of it played out. For the first time in 10 years, I realized my family's survival didn't depend on another transfer from me. The relief of that arrived almost immediately, and grief arrived right behind it, close enough that I couldn't fully separate the two. I had loved that house. My father taught me to solder wiring in its garage before I was tall enough to reach the workbench without a step stool. Paige and I used to draw chalk stars across its driveway every summer until the rain took them. None of that made the house legal tender for the years my mother had spent mortgaging its meaning to keep her own version of events intact. A little before midnight, someone knocked. Paige stood in the hallway in the same silver dress, makeup gone, arms crossed against the cold. She didn't ask to come in. She asked me to call the lender first thing in the morning and describe the whole night as a misunderstanding between family members. Nothing more. I was going to pay it back once the campaign launched, she said. With what revenue? I asked. She didn't answer that. Instead, she told me I'd never really believed in her. Not once. Not even when I handed her $24,500 without asking a single question the first year. I reminded her I'd asked for receipts and never received one. She said the paperwork had made her feel small, like a stranger being audited instead of a sister being helped. Then she said I enjoyed being the competent one, that my career and my relationship made her feel like a permanent failure standing next to me, while our mother only pressured me because she knew I could carry it. Do you know what happens to the person everyone assumes can handle anything? I asked her. No one ever checks whether she should have to. I reminded her that she'd stood 3 feet away while our mother slapped me, and that she'd helped prepare the transfer form beforehand, account number and all. She called our mother emotional and called the whole scheme a fast solution to a problem that wasn't going to wait for anyone's feelings. And then, almost by accident, the real foundation of it slipped out of her, plain and unguarded in a way nothing else she'd said all night had been. I knew you'd fix it eventually, she said. You always do. I'd heard that sentence before, nearly word for word, standing in our mother's kitchen a decade earlier over an unpaid invoice. Except back then it had sounded like a compliment. Standing in my own doorway at midnight, it sounded like exactly what it was. Not desperation, certainty. The quiet, load-bearing belief that consequences in our family were something that eventually became my problem to absorb, no matter whose name was on the paperwork. I'm not fixing this one, I told her. Then you're the one ruining Mom. No, I said. I'm stepping away from what the two of you already ruined. I closed the door before she could answer. Later that night, once the apartment was quiet again, I sat down and documented everything I could remember about the account access and the slap, times, dates, exact wording, while it was still fresh enough to be accurate. Documentation. I was starting to understand was the one boundary neither of them would be able to talk their way around later. By morning, the story had already started moving through Wilmington's wedding circuit on its own. 2 bloggers who covered local venues reached out to the Iron Bridge coordinator directly, repeating an anonymous claim that I had stolen my own sister's wedding fund. Paige, it turned out, was already rewriting the night into a version where she was the one who'd been wronged. Julian sent a short statement to every guest before 9 that morning. The wedding would continue as planned. My mother and Paige would not be attending, and the financial dispute had been referred to counsel. He asked people not to speculate publicly. Only 4 guests canceled. My dressmaker met me at the studio to fix the jacket I'd stained the night before, and when there wasn't enough fabric left to salvage it, she built a simple wrap instead, plain, unfussy, nothing like what I'd originally planned to wear. When she fastened it and stepped back, she looked at my reflection for a long moment before saying anything. This one fits the person standing here now, she said. At 3:00, the theater side of the warehouse opened for the ceremony. I'd chosen Iron Bridge specifically because I'd spent 2 years pulling it back from decades of flood damage and neglect, and because its beauty, to me, had never come from pretending the damage hadn't happened. It came from making the repair visible. Standing in it that afternoon felt like proof that surviving something doesn't require returning to who you were before it. My mother arrived 20 minutes before the ceremony in the same white dress, standing outside with my aunt, arguing that no mother should be excluded from her own daughter's wedding. Julian had formally withdrawn her invitation that morning. My aunt came upstairs anyway and asked whether my mother could have 5 minutes. I agreed to talk through the closed dressing room door. Nothing more. Her first sentence wasn't an apology. "People think Paige committed fraud," she said. "The records suggest she did." "She's your sister." "I know." She told me that if I married Julian today, people would say he'd turned me against my own family. I told her that I was marrying a man who'd taught me that family isn't a license to steal from the people who love you. There was a long pause on the other side of the door. "I shouldn't have slapped you," she finally said. It was the first time in 10 years I'd heard her say something close to an apology without immediately attaching a reason that made it my fault. I asked her, gently, whether she'd thought at all about that moment before it happened, or whether it had simply arrived the way it always did. Then she told me the truth I hadn't asked for yet. Her lender had warned her weeks earlier that the business accounts might freeze. Paige had convinced her that a highly publicized wedding, staged under Bloomfield Staging Co., could attract enough attention and sponsorship interest to solve the crisis before anyone noticed the money had ever moved. They'd planned to use my funds temporarily, replace them quietly before Julian ever reviewed the account, and let everyone believe nothing unusual had happened at all. "You planned to borrow it without asking, and return it before anyone found out," I said. "I was protecting what your father built." "You were protecting the story you tell about yourself," I told her, through the door. What would happen next, regardless of anything said that afternoon, the house would be sold unless she refinanced it independently. The company's real contracts would move to the employees who'd kept it running, and any future relationship between us would require a written admission, full cooperation with the audit, and no contact until I decided I was ready for it. "You're giving me conditions to be your mother," she said. "I'm giving you conditions to stay in my life," I said. "Those aren't the same thing." She left without seeing my face. Security walked her out of the building when she refused to leave the lobby on her own. At 4 o'clock, the lights came down over the aisle, and I walked it alone. I had spent years taking care of everyone else in that family before myself, so walking in without anyone on my arm didn't feel lonely. It felt accurate. When I reached Julian, he asked if I was still sure. "More than I've ever been sure of anything," I said. And we said the rest of it ourselves, promises about honesty and separate ambitions and refusing to let resentment sit quiet long enough to rot something that mattered. 3 weeks later, the independent audit confirmed what the folders had already suggested. Paige had diverted $58,300 through false invoices and borrowed another $22,000 from relatives under misleading claims, including $6,500 from our Aunt Colette, who had believed she was buying actual shares in a company that had never legally issued any. Bloomfield Staging Co. closed within the month. Paige accepted a settlement requiring restitution, financial supervision, and a temporary ban from managing client funds. My mother avoided formal charges by cooperating fully with investigators once the outcome was no longer avoidable. She lost control of Ashford Structural Group. Its real contracts, its equipment, and its 11 employees moved into what we now call Ashford Cooperative Structural Group, owned and run by the people who had kept it alive while the rest of us were busy fighting over its name. The house sold 4 months later, after the mortgage, the credit line, and legal costs were settled. There was enough left for a modest apartment outside the historic district, nothing more. Julian and I used part of what remained of our wedding fund to start something we named the Walter Ashford Apprenticeship, a paid placement program for young tradespeople entering historic structural preservation. I used to think protecting my father's legacy meant protecting his company, his house, his name on a building somewhere. I understand it differently now. A legacy isn't property. It's the principle you choose to keep carrying after the property is gone. 6 months after the wedding, my mother sent a letter, 8 pages long. The first few were about fear and grief. The kind of explanation I would have accepted without question a decade earlier. The last few were different. She listed, plainly, what she had done, without blaming me, Julian, Paige, or stress. She admitted that every time I solved a crisis quietly, she'd felt less obligated to confront the person who caused it. She admitted the slap hadn't been a loss of control. It had been punishment for a daughter who'd finally said no. I agreed to meet her at a small cafe near the river. She arrived early and paid for her own coffee before I sat down. She told me she was working as an office coordinator now and attending a financial accountability group on Thursdays. Paige had moved 2 states away and was working under supervision at an event rental warehouse. My mother still spoke to her occasionally, but no longer paid her bills or called her employers to smooth anything over on her behalf. I thought protecting her made me a good mother, she said. It taught her someone else would always absorb the damage, I said. We agreed to something narrower than reconciliation. No finances between us, no surprise visits, no conversations about Paige unless I brought her up first. One violation would end it. My mother didn't negotiate the terms, which told me more than the letter had. A year after the wedding, Julian and I stood in the back of a small auditorium for the apprenticeship's first graduating class. 5 young tradespeople received their placements that afternoon. One of them, a woman who told me she'd almost left the field entirely because she couldn't afford specialized training on her own, hugged me longer than I expected, and thanked me for something I hadn't fully realized I'd built until she said it out loud. That $85,000 my mother once tried to take from me never funded a staged wedding or a rescued brand. It funded 5 careers instead, and a boundary that finally held.